Wherever you are on the ballot in Maryland this November, this is going to be a national campaign. Control of the Senate, control of the White House, to a certain extent, control of the Congress is going to rest on these votes.
I Hate Politics is a podcast about a human activity we love to hate. I'm Daniel Galileo. This past Tuesday, May 14th of 2024, Maryland voters cast their ballots in the state's primary elections. In a state with a political landscape largely dominated by a single political party, in Maryland's case the Democratic Party, primaries are often more important than general elections. This is because, through the primary process, the party in power anoints the candidates which will more than likely handily win come November. Going into this election, there was scandal on the school board, political dynasty and party establishment intrigue, a struggle between money and alternative political capital, and disillusionment with presumptive candidates, all at play. To parse out the results we saw, and make sense of what happened, I spoke with Dr. Sunil Dasgupta and Dr. Andrew Nolan, who are the program directors of the University of Maryland Baltimore County's Political Science and History programs, respectively, at the universities at Shady Grove in Rockville, Maryland. I Hate Politics is a podcast about our neighborhoods, workplaces, schools and streets, and our local governments as they function in diverse and democratic societies. This means our politics are messy, dirty, sometimes corrupt, with often self-serving politicians. But no matter how much we may hate politics, we are never exempt from them, even when we refuse to participate. In fact, the purpose of politics is to keep society functioning precisely when we don't agree with each other, like now. Music for this episode comes from Washington, D.C.'s post-punk rock band, Gray Swift. Mike Mongericina on guitar and vocals, Fabrizio Cariani on guitar and backing vocals, Evan Hurd on bass, and Chris Blackburn on the drums. Dr. Andrew Nolan, welcome back to I Hate Politics.
Thank you.
And perhaps more unusually for regular listeners of this show, for the first time ever, Dr. Sunil Dasgupta, welcome to I Hate Politics.
Thank you, Daniel. It does feel to be weird on the other side.
So I want to start sort of at the darkest depths of the down ballot and talk about the school board results that we saw last night. To get everyone up to speed, in the lead up to the election, the school board was embroiled in a months-long scandal involving Farquhar Middle School principal Joel Beidelman and numerous unaddressed allegations of sexual harassment. With the results that we saw last night, with the exception of the at-large seat, both of the incumbents in the race look like they are going to be ousted. Dr. Nolan, I want to start with you and talk about what the sort of historical importance of political scandal has been in electoral outcomes and why we might be seeing the results that we are right now in the school board race.
I'm not sure historical importance of scandal is something that we can isolate so easily, in part because scandals differ from time to time. We have very recently seen people weather scandals quite easily in terms of electoral politics. And then at other times, we've seen scandals bring people down. I'm reminded, for example, that when Bill Clinton was impeached, this was widely considered to have been the end of his presidency. It absolutely did not do that. When I look at the school board, what hit me was the degree to which, in many ways, it was the Beidelman scandal first. But more importantly, and this is something that I actually picked up from Dr. Dasgupta's podcast as well, a general sense that the school board was one of two things: either completely hapless and did not know how to handle this, or they handled it and bungled it quite badly. And I think that the answers that the school board interview subjects gave to Dr. Dasgupta kind of reinforced that. So when the scandal broke, rather than find a way to manage it, and that's often the way these things work, is a scandal breaks and you need to management. Historically, there is one thing you'll notice. It's not really as important who's attacking you as it is who's defending you. And I think that's what's important. No one really stood up to defend the school board incumbents, and they all pretty much took it on the chin. I mean, you did mention the at-large candidate. All of these school board candidates should have cruised to reelection, given the way things are working. But two of them, as you said, are clearly trailing and look like they're likely to lose in the general. And the one who's ahead is, I just checked to make sure, with all but 2 precincts in, she's got a 21 vote lead. I think that is a warning sign that people are displeased with the scandal, but more importantly, extremely displeased with how the Board of Education has handled it. And if I had to sum it up, I would say the report that they had commissioned and then issued with the redactions kind of is a metaphor for how people feel. The report took too long. It did not really give people the information they wanted, and it didn't lead to any kind of substantive changes. When that happens, when people feel that a scandal has erupted and the people responsible for it are not addressing it, and there's no one standing up to defend them, historically, that's when incumbents lose elections and you bring in reform candidates. The one thing that I find interesting here, and Dr. Dasgupta, you might be able to enlighten us a little more, I never really got the sense that the opponents of the incumbents really made the Beidelman scandal front and center their campaign issue. They certainly addressed it, but they did not hammer it in the way that you often see happen when a scandal erupts. Am I not reading the landscape correctly?
I think you're right. I think the campaign was not largely fought on those grounds, though I think that was one data point among many that showed that the school board had not done its job. Whether, it's the attendance policy, it's the bullying safety kinds of issues. There are several issues that are pending at the school board, and the school board seems unable to drive the ship. Whether they are supposed to drive the ship or not, that's a different question, right? And so usually incumbents in school boards sail. But look at what happened. In District 2, the incumbent is not even going to get past the primary, right? In District 4, the incumbent, Shebra Evans, is going to go to the general, but barely. And even if all the votes of the third placed candidate go to Shebra Evans, she'll still be short of Laura Stewart, who is leading in that race. There are essentially 3 slates, if you will, in the race, right? One is the incumbent slate, which is, Shebra Evans in D4, Rebecca Smondrowski in D2, and Lynn Harris in at large. There's an Apple ballot list, which is the Apple ballot meaning those that are endorsed by the teachers union, and that is Laura Stewart in D4, Natalie Zimmerman in D2, and Rita Montoya in the at-large seat. And there's a third kind of slate that came about. It's not an official, none of these are official slates, but that's what it feels like in the election time. So there was Brenda Diaz in District 2, who is actually the only one of the slate that's going to go into the general. And Bethany Mandel, who is really a lightning rod on the conservative side on education issues in particular. And she is going to be defeated, I believe, by Shebra Evans in D4, barely.
One interesting thing to add to that, looking at the results, you see that for the 2 district candidates, it's pretty clear that the people who voted in person on election day emphatically chose the Apple ballot. They went with the non-incumbent. The only race that was a little unusual is that I believe the at-large race, Lynn Harris actually did at least as well as Rita Montoya in same-day voting. So it's like when you look at the mail-in ballots and the early voting, the incumbents were doing okay. It was really what happened yesterday. And what that, to me, is often a sign of is people started paying attention late in the race. Those are the people who tend to vote on election day. And so as attention in the electorate focused on the race, it turned against the incumbents. It turned against one of those ballots that Dr. Dasgupta is mentioning.
I think to that point, primary election voters are a very different electorate in comparison to who votes in general elections. That primary voters are typically higher information, typically more engaged, and I think for the most part know what they're voting for a little bit better than people who show up on general election day in November will be. So do you think that that will have any impact going forward into November, and that, like, obviously if the general election happened today, the incumbents would be entirely rebuked. But given the time in between now and November, will that sort of begin to fizzle and we'll see the incumbents make a comeback, or is this sort of the final nail in the coffin?
Well, I think those are two different elections. Primary and the general are different elections. And in this case, this year, the elections in Maryland, they are going to become nationalized, particularly because of the Senate and because of presidential race. So once it's nationalized, I think the dynamics of the race change. More people show up. Voter turnout was particularly low in the primary, and will be significantly larger in the general. One thing to note at the local level is that, the school board is going from having several African American members to now potentially having one. If Shebra Evans loses the general elections, then we'll have Brenda Wolf being the only African American member of the board, which is actually extraordinary. So I imagine that given that, there may be some coalescence of support behind Shebra Evans in the general. NAACP, the very powerful pastors in Black churches in the county. But whether that is sufficient to overcome the lead that Laura Stewart clearly has is an open question. Laura Stewart is also highly connected with the Democratic establishment in Southern Montgomery County. And so she's in a kind of a different place. D2 race up county, it's a little bit different. And there, if you nationalize that race, I think what happens is then it becomes a referendum on, what kind of school board you want, whether you want Brenda Diaz, who, when she was on the show, said that she took her source on vaccination to be RFK Jr.
Yes, she did.
versus Natalie Zimmerman, who is the Apple ballot candidate. The Beidelman scandal, I believe, and I think I said this before, is a data point in the overall disenchantment with the Board of Education in Montgomery County. Lots of people actually are saying, in fact, the school system used to be great, right? Kind of like make MCPS great again.
There are so many things that I think the school board has simply failed to deliver on in terms of communication. For all I know, they may be doing a great job. They're not communicating that. There are outlets out there. Some of the people have been reaching out to them, others have not. And I think it is not an accident that the ones who had the least exposure to local media, podcasts, et cetera, are the ones who are doing the worst in the election right now.
I want to touch on an apparent failure of the teachers' union endorsements with the Apple ballot. That their House endorsement in District 6, Joe Vogel, was very soundly defeated by April Delaney, despite the fact that they were able to deliver such decisive victories for their endorsees in the school board. They were not able to do the same for their Senate endorsement and one of their House endorsements.
Joe Vogel's district, the one that he ran in, District 6, is about 35-40% in Montgomery County, 35-40% in Frederick County, and 20% in Western Maryland, in Mountain Maryland. So I think the votes would have been distributed over that entire area. Where teachers union have the greatest sway whether you like it or not, is in Montgomery. So it would be good to break down those votes and see, what how Vogel did in the three parts I described.
So let's talk about District 6. The clear elephant in the room in this race is the fact that with Trone out of the picture as an incumbent, April Delaney came to essentially capitalize on the political dynasty that her husband established there, being the longtime representative of Maryland District 6 before attempting to run for president in 2020. Was political dynasty what delivered this race for Delaney, or was it something else?
Well, name recognition is going to play a role, especially as you mentioned in a primary race where you've got people paying attention to that kind of thing. But I think part of it has to be given to the campaign that April Delaney ran. She, I think, understands the voters, and you could argue that's because she is part of an establishment network already built in there. But she understands the district, she understands the voters. I think she positioned herself very well to win endorsements, to get attention, and to win votes. I mean, the fact is Vogel didn't come within 10 points of her. So I think she had a pretty clear lock on what it was going to take to win this district, and she delivered it.
Well, I mean, they're very different candidates, right? Joe is 27 years old. April Delaney is an established long-term Commerce Department official, been involved, as part of her husband's political career, and has the network there to be able to, mobilize voters. She won the endorsement of Jamie Raskin, which is a big one. She won the endorsement of Jan Gardner, who was the formidable former county executive of Frederick County. And that's a big one in that area. I had thought that Jan Gardner might run herself, but she did not. But when she endorsed April Delaney, I was pretty certain at that point that the establishment up county, Montgomery County, Frederick, and other Garrett, Allegheny would come out in favor of her.
I think that that's definitely something to think about moving forward into the general election, is that Maryland's congressional maps are relatively new, and that there is a sense that District 6 in particular is one of the more competitive of the districts now. Do you think that the Republicans stand any chance there? Do you think that April Delaney needs to run hard in the general in order to win, or do you think that it's a coast from here on out?
Not a coast. Not a coast, not in that district. No, I think April Delaney will have to run. I think none of the races this fall are going to be a coast. And I think any candidate that takes it that way is going to be in for a rude awakening. You'll have to campaign. And I think April Delaney's well positioned. But just looking at the vote totals, admittedly, it's a primary, but April Delaney got fewer votes overall than Neil Parrott. So you add up the two totals, this is going to be a tough race. And I think that there's a chance that the Republicans could have a second congressional seat in Maryland. Yeah, I could see that happening.
So with April Delaney cinching this seat, I think that it begs the question about what the point of running for office might be for someone that doesn't have these immense access to resources, connections, that, if anything, that the District 6 primary was essentially preordained the moment that she stepped in the race. So why should we run for office if this is the case?
Oh, I think Vogel's running for office was a smart thing to do, and Delaney's victory wasn't at all preordained. I think Vogel learned a lot about running an electoral campaign. And in fact, when you look at young candidates, you often find that a loss can be as important in propelling them to attention as a victory. Barack Obama lost his race for state senate, and it was that election campaign and how he did in it that brought him to the attention of the National Party. So I don't think that you look at running simply as a means of you win or lose. I mean, that's the whole point of politics. You will lose elections along the way. You will. That doesn't make it easy to bear. It's bitter, it's awful, but at the same time, you learn from your losses. But you can't really know what it's like to be in a campaign until you've done it. So I think Vogel learned a lot. I don't expect Vogel to never run again. And I think he's much better positioned now. Those connections you're talking about, those networks you're talking about, that's how you build them. You go out, you talk to people, you meet them, you make friends, you make enemies, you figure out how to bring the two together. That's an important part of the process. So I think the experience itself is useful. And also, you never know when you, the 27-year-old, will all of a sudden be the one who's the nominee. There's no saying that Delaney was going to run the campaign she did. Maybe she stumbles. Maybe there's a scandal. You can't predict.
Let's talk about District 3. That was a much larger primary than District 6 was. I think that there were a lot of potentially very competitive candidates in that race, and that Sarah Elfreth just happened to be the most competitive of them. I believe that the sense early on might have been that Harry Dunn was just a very prominent candidate, but not necessarily a popular one, despite the fact that he ended up getting second place. Why do you think that Sarah Elfreth was able to differentiate herself in this huge pack of candidates, though?
She also became a nationally prominent candidate. And by that, I don't mean she necessarily got notoriety, but she got money from national organizations, and specifically AIPAC really saw in her an opportunity.
I think it makes a difference when you have a really crowded primary like that to have the establishment support.
I want to turn our attention to a race for Congress that was not at all competitive in District 8. That this was an election that was decided
within seconds.
With what's happening in the Gaza Strip right now, there is an immense amount of attention being paid to the Congress, especially two prominent members of Congress like Jamie Raskin, that he was heckled in a way that I don't think that he had been in his congressional career up to this point, when he spoke at the University of Maryland and then subsequently had a very controversial vote where he voted in the negative of sending additional military aid to Israel. Do you think that despite the fact that he is completely safe in being able to win his primary and the general election in November, is there a way to pressure candidates outside of electoral threats?
Of course, I think there's a way. And I think that Jamie Raskin is pretty clearly giving this a lot of attention. To counter the two incidents you mentioned, there's also the recent vote he made endorsing the definition of anti-Semitism that I think is also proven widely controversial. He is, I think, trying to find his way in this issue, as are many national politicians. So I think you're watching Jamie Raskin respond to pressure in real time. I don't think for him it's just a matter of, do I have to worry about losing my seat, but really worrying about what will deliver for my constituents and for the electorate at large. But Dr. Dasgupta, your thoughts?
Well, Jamie Raskin is beloved in Southern Montgomery County. I'm not sure any of this poses a serious risk to him. What I think is at issue is that younger voters are pressing him to be cautious about supporting Israel, giving Israel a blank check.
So speaking of how beloved Raskin is, I think that it's undeniable that his endorsement of Angela Alsobrooks in the Senate race had something to do with the fact that she completely ran away with that primary. Why do you think that someone who comparatively spent so little money in contrast with their opponent was able to win such a definitive victory?
The truth is that to all those who believe that money drives politics, it is not 100% true. Money is important to politics, as money is important to any part of life. But it is not the be all and end all. And repeatedly, this is shown. Whether you see it here or you see in Baltimore with the money that David Smith spent behind Sheila Dixon, right? That for money to prevail in elections, other things have to go right. if it's money, but other things are, but everybody else is arrayed against you, it actually doesn't work. The fact that the entirety of the Democratic establishment came out against Trone and for Alsobrooks is one reason that this changes. And Jamie Raskin is obviously the icing on the cake, but everybody like Chris Van Hollen, Wes Moore, just you can think of anybody, Aruna Miller, anybody you can think of did it, with the exception, of course, of, council members in Prince George's County and the Prince George's County State's Attorney, Aisha Braveboy.
Oh, and the state attorney general. If anyone knows us in an academic setting, they would know that what I'm about to say is very rare, but I thoroughly agree with what Dr. Dasgupta is saying here. I thoroughly agree with it. I think it did show that while money is crucial, it can be overstated. And that may be why pollsters pulled out of this race as soon as they did, because I know that the initial polls showed Trone with not a commanding, but a pretty sizable lead over Alsobrooks. But she clearly focused on marshaling support from the establishment. And one of the things the establishment can do is get committed voters out, which is what you need in a primary. And she got them out in numbers. I think another thing it shows is that there may be a sense, and this may be the difference between District 6 and the rest of the state, that Trone is a more centrist Democrat and Alsobrooks is more authentically committed to Democratic issues. And I think that is, when you give the voters statewide that choice, they go with the Democrat they see as more authentically committed to what they believe in. You're asking people to choose between a candidate who is recognized statewide. Everyone in Maryland knows Larry Hogan. Outside of Prince George's County until recently, Alsobrooks was not a major statewide figure. It's no shock they picked Hogan. I promise you this. My guess is if you were to ask Republican officials, they would say they got the candidate they fear more. They'd rather have run against Trone than Alsobrooks in the general, because I think in the general, Alsobrooks can count on the Democratic establishment, can count on the fact that it's a blue county, and to get to Dr. Dasgupta's point, Larry Hogan can't run as a governor. He's got to run as a senator. And so what's his position on abortion going to be? What's his position on immigration going to be? What's his position on accepting the outcomes of a close presidential election going to be? These are all issues that he didn't have to address as a governor the way he will have to address as a candidate. David Trone was going to be a little more, shall we say, moderate on those positions. Angela Alsobrooks won't be. And I think that she's going to put up a clear contrast. I genuinely think the Republicans would rather have run against Trone. And I think they knew that back in January.
As a follow-up to that, your first appearance on the show, Dr. Nolan, was in the wake of the leak of the decision that became the Dobbs versus Jackson's Women Health Association back in 2022, and that the issue of bodily autonomy and the legality of abortion is a huge specter on these national races, where we see in places like Arizona, they're invoking these territorial laws in order to take abortion rights away, and that there is huge fear that there could potentially be the introduction of a national abortion ban. Do you think that that might have also been a huge reason why people felt more comfortable voting for Alsobrooks over Trone?
I wouldn't say more comfortable. I think emphatically chose Alsobrooks over Trone. I think that they believed that Alsobrooks was more committed to preserving bodily autonomy than Trone was. And I think that is something that she made part of her campaign. And we're going to see an amendment on the ballot this fall. Am I correct about that, Dr. Dasgupta, about abortion rights in Maryland? So that's going to be something else that will give Alsobrooks another way to differentiate herself from Hogan.
Let me do what I sometimes do with this. I think that on the issues themselves, that Trone and Alsobrooks are fairly close. That if Trone had won, his positions, his votes in the Senate would be no more different on abortion or any of those things than Alsobrooks's. So that, and so when you get that kind of lack of differentiation, which is fairly common in a primary, by the way, right? In primary elections are within the party. And so people are programmatically very close to each other. And therefore, what does a voter use to distinguish one from the other, right? I think what then voters choose is based on identity rather than on issues alone. Alsobrooks is a very different person than David Trone, a wealthy businessman, white, Alsobrooks, county executive, black, on one of the biggest black counties in the country. So they are very different people. The Maryland congressional delegation had no women. She, together with Elfreth and now April Delaney, would add 3 women to that delegation. I think that was a big drive for women, almost as much as abortion. Now, abortion is going to be an issue. Don't get me wrong. Abortion is going to be an issue vis-a-vis Larry Hogan. I'm not sure how much abortion was an issue vis-a-vis Trump.
I don't disagree with what you're saying about the votes, Dr. Descripta, but I think it actually was with Trone because, as you said, people chose identity and they looked and they said, sure, they're both going to vote for it, but who's going to fight for it? And I think Trone would have voted for it. I don't see him fighting for it. I could understand Alsobrooks delivering a filibuster on the Senate floor. And I feel like Angela Alsobrooks did a better job of delivering on what she would do as a senator.
The more the election nationalizes, I believe Alsobrooks has a better chance of winning because that'll turn out the Democratic side even more.
So to pull this back out to the race on everybody's mind that was clearly the least interesting of what was on the ballot, right at the top, the presidential primary.
Yes.
So in the hours before Marylanders began casting their same-day votes, Jake Sullivan at the White House in the press room got up and said, "We do not believe what is happening in Gaza is a genocide. We have been firmly on the record rejecting that proposition." And in the results that we have thus far in Maryland's presidential Democratic primary, 10.4% of Maryland Democrats voted uncommitted. Obviously, Biden is going to get the delegates from Maryland. That's not what's in question here. But is this a significant enough number of people expressing their dissatisfaction with the options in the Democratic primary that it might have reverberating effects nationally in the outcome of the presidential election?
I think you've heard me say this before. An election is not an open choice. It's not a love match, right? It is a constrained, selection. What is the option for folks? They want Trump back on the Democratic side? I don't think that's true. So even though this is pretty bad, I think both campaigns know this. And that's why they are courting the group that is most likely to switch, which is wealthier, richer people.
Yes, at the same time, while Trump got 80% of the vote in Maryland's Republican primary, Nikki Haley, who dropped out close to 3 months ago at this point, got 20% of the vote share.
There are lots of things that are inexplicable about the electoral process.
I think to sort of bring us back out, what do you think that voters should look for going into the general election with these results?
I'm not sure it's for the voters to look for. I think voters have been trying to communicate what they want. I think it's up to politicians. I mean, whether it's Alsobrooks, whether it's Delaney, whether it's Lynn Harris, they need to figure out what's the message that will get votes, especially, and I think Dr. Descripta is absolutely right about this, wherever you are on the ballot in Maryland this November, this is going to be a national campaign. Control of the Senate, control of the White House, to a certain extent, control of the Congress is going to rest on these votes. And I think that that's going to mean you want to think very strategically about how your message fits with others' messages. So everyone is going to have to be thinking, how do we attract the voters that we need, who we support, to support us.
On the Democratic side, I think they're going to run a national campaign up and down the ballot. Voters are going to vote based on this idea, even if it's not true for Maryland, because Maryland, all the voters, they're going to go to Biden and all. They're going to run as if the White House and the Congress depended on
Dr.
it.
Sunil Dasgupta, Dr. Andrew Nolan, thank you for taking the time. I think we all know a lot more than we did when we started.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Daniel.
I'll be back with the wrap-up. Stick with us. What lessons can we draw from my conversation with Dr. Dasgupta and Dr. Nolan about Maryland's 2024 primary election results? For me, there are two major points. Firstly, the importance of not underestimating high-information voters. Voters in primary elections are demonstrably more engaged with the news and have better understanding of who they are voting for and why. The attention that voters in the Montgomery County Public Schools Board of Education election paid to the apparent malfeasance of the school system, particularly in the Beidelman scandal, resulted in a strong rebuke of incumbent candidates who should have handily advanced to the general election. Secondly, the formidable power of establishment machines in delivering party nominations for candidates. In the competitive House and Senate primaries, deep political connections which resulted in key endorsements were seemingly the deciding factor in many races. This alternative political capital, in the case of Angela Alsobrooks besting David Trone, is an avenue through which the seemingly insurmountable obstacle of being outspent by an opponent can be overcome. The voters delivered strong rejections of some candidates and championed others to decisive victories. Even in a relatively uncompetitive state in the presidential contest like Maryland, voters were able to deliver an expression of dissatisfaction through a presidential primary which otherwise would not warrant discussion. And that is democracy as we understand it at work. That's all for this episode of I Hate Politics, where we aim to stem the decline of local news by working with community voices. We'll be back on Tuesday morning for our weekly news bulletin, I Hate the News. Be sure to tune in. I Hate Politics is produced by Sunil Dasgupta and assistant producers Katerina Gasick, Catherine Amaya Escobar, and me, Daniel Galileo, with support from the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, where Dr. Dasgupta directs the political science program at the universities at Shady Grove in Montgomery County, where students like myself explore and learn about politics, government, and society close to home. Music for this episode comes from Washington, D.C.'s post-punk rock band, Ray Swift. Mike Mangiricina on guitar and vocals, Fabrizio Cariani on guitar and backing vocals, Evan Hurd on bass, and Chris Blackburn on the drums. If you want to share your music on the show, or know someone else who would, please email us at producer@ihppod.org. I hope you'll subscribe and share the podcast as we continue to bring you stories about politics close to you and to your home. See you next time.